Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, in today's episode, we're jumping back to the layout planning for Paul's layout, which is Sandling Junction. And also, at the end of this video, there's some exciting news too that I'd also like to share with you all. So for those who've been following the series on some layout planning and using track planning software, and of course this is in conjunction with Paul and Sandling Junction, and of course his new layout that he wishes to build upstairs in his kind of loft type area. So where we left off, of course, we'd got to a point with the track plan that I think is mostly locked in place. That doesn't mean to say, though, of course, that there is a certain amount of fluidness to that track plan where things may get altered as the actual build begins. But in today's episode, we now take a look at how the baseboard layers and of course the framework is going to be worked out. Now, one of the prerequisites that Paul would really like to have for his layout, of course, is having sections of the layout that he can lift up and take off and move to a different area, work on the underside of these panels for things like point motors and any kind of wiring and hooking up of power supplies. So a little bit like what Charlie from Chadwick Model Railway does. He has these large sections which he can lift up and work on the underside of them without having to scramble around on his hands and knees on his back underneath the layout. So that's the intention or plan in terms of Paul's layout with Sandling Junction. So the process basically that I used, and I'll go into a little bit of detail describing how I've carved everything up later in this video, but essentially really what it comes down to is taking the track plan that I've worked on and then transferring that over to what I use as Illustrator. Now, of course, Inkscape is another good alternative, and of course that's a free application for doing this type of work as well, but it's a case of taking it through into Illustrator, and then from there I can actually work at one-to-one size and actually start working out the panels, how they'll be broken up, how big they'll be, and things like that. Now, I believe you can actually do all of this stuff in Rail Modeler Pro, but I just find that side of Rail Modeler Pro just a little bit tricky, and I'm just not used to its functionality as I am with Illustrator, which of course I use for my job. So I know Illustrator pretty much like the back of my hand. So once in Illustrator, then it's a case of starting to map out where these sections of baseboard are going to be broken and separated, what pieces are going to be lift out sections, and then of course actually one of the key components is working out the framework. Now, we know that Paul's layout is very bespoke in a lot of ways. There's nothing really overly standard about it, and that is really because the space or the room that this layout is going to is a very unusual shaped room. So I knew really from the outset that the frame really wasn't going to be any different. So it's a case of sort of working out and kind of looking ahead as if I was actually building it and working out the size of some of the baseboard panels that maybe they could be taken downstairs, taken to the garage, brought back up once they've been worked on, and also with the framework as well. Maybe the framework is built in sections and then brought up and then kind of assembled as a complete unit. Now, of course, the other side too with the framework is making sure that the framework underneath doesn't collide with things like point motors and any other kind of gadgets or electrical connections and things like that that would be underneath the layout that are required for the track, or any other components. For example, there's a turntable, it needs to have a bit of clear space. So one of the things that I think Paul and I decided on right from the beginning is that he really liked to go down the route of an open framework. So it's not a framework where the framework is completely enclosed or covered over with solid baseboard, that there is actually cavities and gaps, and where these gaps are, of course, they are stitched together with scenic items, landscaping and hillsides and so forth. So through the process of working these elements out in Illustrator, I was able to start to build up the layout, and of course using layers within Illustrator you're able to create a frame layer, a baseboard layer, and so on and so forth. So with that all done and completed, what we'll do is I'll just jump over and run through and describe all of the different sections I've made and why the framework was set up and designed in the way it has been set up. So as I mentioned, I'm using Illustrator here, and of course there is Inkscape, which is the free vector-based software that can be used to pretty much do exactly the same thing. Now, I'm not overly familiar with Inkscape, but if you head over to Chanwell, to Michael's channel, he uses Inkscape extensively to build his scratch-built card buildings, and I think he's quite au fait with that particular software. But there are a lot of similarities between Inkscape and Illustrator. So I've laid in the plan, and this is actually at 1:1, so this is the full size. It's nearly 5 meters across from here to here, and I've just put this on a opaque level, so it's about 30% opacity, just so that it's fogged out. Now we've got some layers over here, and the best way for me to work through this in terms of the baseboard panels and the framework is to, of course, work in layers. So we'll start with the first layer that I assembled, and this is the main baseboard layers or lower baseboard layers, and selecting that, we've now got some various colored panels here, and it's the only way I could sort of work it so that I could sort of define what on earth is going on here, because it does actually become a little bit complex during this phase. So the green shaded panels, for example here, and this piece over here, they are flat layers, so they're the only layers that have no inclines of any sort in them. All the other colors, so the purple, the blue, and this orangey color, they're all in some form or another got an incline on them, so it becomes quite complex. So we'll start with the purple panels, and this is down at the framework layer, so the base framework layer is where it goes underneath this bridge here, and this whole section slowly rises up and rises up around here and comes up to the incline where it then crosses back over the top. So as you can imagine, there's a subtle incline here, and where there's a join in the baseboard, this section of baseboard levels off. So this level section of baseboard is actually slightly above the main framework, so obviously we'll need to put some form of spacers in there to raise it up to meet this part of the incline here. Then the next section is a curved section around here, and that runs up. We've got another section here which is just a rectangular section, and then another section here. Now I've broken it up into these sections. You can see some lines running through here, just simply cutting the panels out of sheets of plywood, and of course jigsaw cutting these shapes out is probably going to be the easiest way to carve all this up into its respective sections. So this incline rises up, and then by the time it reaches this point, it's about 90 millimeters above the main framework. So the plan is, and when we get into the framework layout, I'll demonstrate that, but the idea is for it to be mostly an open framework, or as open as it possibly can be, So as you can see, the baseboards are only actually where the track is running around this part. So this section here, of course, is all hidden. So then if we come back to the beginning again, knowing that this is at the framework level, the main framework level, these orange sections of baseboard then begin to incline in the opposite direction. So that runs up a little bit here, and of course where this harbour siding comes in, this is all level. So this green panel, much like the one over here, is actually slightly higher than the framework level once again, and the reason for that is that it also gives the ability to sink a harbour scene into this particular baseboard. So I've kind of left it very much open to interpretation around here, because there may well be more sidings. This is not exactly how this might actually look in the finished layout. So these sidings might come a little bit further this way. There'll be some head shunts, various other things in here that will alter this entire area. So we've got this orange panel here, once again a bit of an unusual shape like most of this, and then we've got another panel that comes around here. Now I haven't actually divided this up, but it will probably have a division somewhere through here, because this is simply too big to cut out of one sheet of plywood. So there may well be another division through here, and there might be one somewhere through here. So the final section here is this blue strip of plywood that will run around the back here, not forgetting that this is all open framework in between and around here, which will then be stitched together with scenery and so forth. So that of course runs the other way. So from this point we've got the incline running down as it gradually comes down and wraps around and heads under here. Now where it reaches this point, it's slightly lower, so the incline comes down, and then here, this blue line, the incline comes back up again. So it's almost like there's a little bit of a dip at its lowest point on this blue line. It comes around and starts climbing around here. It's overlaid over the top of this orange panel, so this blue is actually up above, and it reaches this point where it's now another 90 millimeters above the purple baseboards. So effectively roughly about 180-200 millimeters above the main framework at this point here. So if we add in the upper baseboards, which is this section in here, so this point here, or the elevation here where this blue line comes up, is equal to this area here, and then these three blue panels are above everything else and they're all level. So this area here is about 180-200 millimeters above the main baseboard frame. Now I've carved this up into 3 panels, and the idea behind this is to make these, or give the opportunity for Paul to be able to lift these panels off, do his wiring, do his point work, install turntables, install pits in the depot sheds, all of those kind of things. And so this is one panel that could potentially be a lift out section, and it can come off whenever, and he can take it elsewhere and model it. It is the largest section, and the size on this section is 1.6 by roughly 1 meter. So it is a reasonably large panel, but in saying that, I think it's still achievable to be able to take it downstairs, take it into his garage, maybe if his wife might let him pop it on the kitchen table. The opportunity there to be able to take this elsewhere and work on it is really key here. And then of course we then have another panel here, and whether or not these are also lift out panels, they could be. I think it might be worth having them as lift out panels, because if anything ever goes belly up underneath here in these hidden sidings or around this incline section, then if need be, these panels can be lifted off in order to retrieve locomotives or any kind of train carnage that might have occurred underneath. So they're the panels as they are, and of course one of the things that you note is that there's nothing in here that's really of a regular shape. They're all quite unique and quite bespoke, and the only way that it really works that way is because the layout itself is so bespoke, the room is bespoke, that there's nothing normal about this layout in the sense of where it's positioned and how we are able to actually fit all this stuff in here. So there will be some careful measuring when it comes to cutting out these panel shapes and so forth, but of course the framework gets built first, and then of course we can align the panels to those frames and trim as necessary. So the next layer that I'll switch on is now the main baseboard frame. So this is the same level throughout the entire layout. It's the kind of main baseboard framework, and it is kind of done in sections. So for example, this framework can be assembled here in one section, then this piece here can be assembled, and so on and so forth. So parts of it can be built in components, brought upstairs, and then all bolted or screwed together. You'll notice that I've tried to, wherever I can, is to have perpendicular joins in the framework where we can access the other side to drill in some screws. So in most situations I've tried to avoid where perpendicular sections of the framework don't actually meet either side of each other. So the other important aspect, of course, within the framework is making sure that the frames don't end up going where there's going to be point motors or other items, for example turntables and so forth. So being an open framework, if for example there is an issue under here that needs a little bit of maintenance, then Paul could get under the layout and access all of this underneath without having to lift the section off. So, but in saying that, the section can still be taken off if need be, maybe in more drastic situations. So there is going to be a little bit of math working out this framework and bringing the components up and assembling them. So this is, as I said, the main baseboard framework, and where there's areas like this, for example where the green panel here is for these hidden storage yards, that will sit on this framework, but it will be stepped up slightly. So as you recall, this is an incline running up here, so by the time it's reached this point it could be possibly 20, maybe 15-20 millimeters higher than the main framework. So through here we can add in spaces, and I put in framework so we can bolt in or screw in risers through here to elevate this level section of baseboard here. The same goes for here. So the idea is this would be jigsaw cut out with some ply, and then what we can do is we can add in some risers which we can then G-clamp to the main framework, adjust the levels until we get the absolute perfect incline, including maybe even a little bit of super elevation if need be and things like that. So that can be all adjusted with G-clamps, and when it's all absolutely spot on, then the risers which would be attached to the framework can be permanently screwed into place. So the same applies around here, where we would actually have further risers that are adjustable using some G-clamps, and then once we get this incline absolutely spot on, then those risers can then be permanently screwed to the main framework. And once again the same for this line here as well. Of course the risers here are going to get quite a lot higher than the main framework, but I think it's a decent foundation of it. And of course this is not to say that this framework is set in stone, because I think with the layout, the framework, the track work and everything, there is going to be a certain amount of fluidness to how things are going to work, so there will be some adjustments here and there. But as I mentioned, the main thing is to sort of work out where we can put framework that's not going to collide with points, point motors, frog wires and all of that kind of stuff. So the last layer, of course, is the upper layer, which is this whole entire upper section, and I might just switch off the lower baseboard layer so we can see it more clearly. And this is the framework for the upper section, and it is done in two sections. So we've got a section here of framework which is all to do with the depot area, and as I mentioned, it'll have its own piece of baseboard section, and this whole piece can be lifted out. And then the same goes for this. This could be lifted out, but I'm more inclined to think this would be a permanent framework in here, but maybe the baseboard panels on top could be lifted up. So that framework sits more or less in line with some of the framework underneath, so that we've got crossovers where we can attach risers to add to this upper level, which is essentially going to be 180, 200 millimeters higher than the framework underneath. So once again, this framework here that has been deliberately placed in certain ways so that it avoids point work in here, and there's some areas you might think that that will actually collide, but I have worked it out. There is actually a short section of track in there. Some of these areas might need some fine tuning, and they may be a little bit tight where you might find a point motor that's tucked in right next to some framework, but otherwise it's mostly clear. The same goes for here. The way that this framework has been done is so that these two engine sheds can have pits inside them that drop below the baseboard level. So once again, we had to do framework that wouldn't collide with any of that stuff. We've got loads of clearance for the turntable and its mechanism underneath, and then all of these points are clear. So hence why the framework is so peculiar in a lot of ways. So it is a very bespoke layout. So there we have it for the baseboard panels and all of the framework. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of fluidity within this framework and the baseboards, because I'm sure that when it comes to actually doing the build, and once Paul starts laying track, that there may be some modifications and changes that may be required, where possibly a strut might need to be moved an inch one way or an inch the other way, or any other possible issues that may be encountered during the construction phase. So getting on to this exciting news, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the video, and this is that in October there of course is the Great Electric Train Show in Milton Keynes, and I think it's the 14th, 15th of October. I could be wrong. I should have actually locked in those dates by now, but the exciting news is I will actually be there at the Great Electric Train Show. Now, this is actually my very first trip to the UK. I've never been to the UK before. I've never even been to Europe. I've only got as far as the United States in my travels, and of course Australia being just over the ditch, and of course a few of the Pacific Islands. So UK, it's a new adventure, and I'm travelling over there, and really at the end of the day the whole trip is totally and utterly centred around trains and model railways. So of course I'll be obviously going to the National Railway Museum, and of course I'm also going to the North Yorkshire Moors Railway as well. So there's a action-packed trip coming up for me in October, but of course one of these highlights is going to the Getz exhibition in Milton Keynes. So it'll be absolutely fantastic to meet anyone who of course watches my channel, and it's also going to be fantastic to meet some of the other YouTubers out there who contribute of course to the model railway community. So exciting times, and I'm very much looking forward to being there. So I'll leave it there for today's video. Certainly hope you've got some ideas or inspiration, or maybe a bit of more of an insight of course into the planning of a layout. Do take care everyone, look after yourselves, of course don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.